The wind was a sculptor of memories, carving the New Mexico buttes into shapes of raw loneliness that Caleb Shaw knew in his own bones. It was a merciless artist, peeling away the topsoil, scouring the life from anything that did not grip the earth with desperate, gnarled roots. His ranch was a testament to that desperation, a collection of low, sun-bleached buildings hunkered against the vast, indifferent sky. For 5 years, the wind had been his only constant companion, its ceaseless howl a fitting chorus for the silence that had taken root inside him. He rode the fence line not because it needed checking, but because movement was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. The creak of saddle leather, the rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves on the baked clay. These were the sounds that filled the space where a wife's laughter and a child's questions once lived. He carried that absence like a stone in his gut, a cold, heavy weight that dictated the stoic set of his jaw and the distance in his pale blue eyes. The sun was a hammer beating down on the parched land, and the heat rising from the ground distorted the horizon into a wavering line of impossibilities. It was in that shimmering haze that he saw it, a smudge of color against the dun canvas of rock and creosote. Not a coyote or a fallen calf. It was human. He reined in his gelding, the animal sensing the shift in his posture, the sudden tension that coiled through him. Trouble, out here, came in only one form: final. He dismounted, rifle held loosely in his hand, and approached with the caution of a man who understood how quickly the desert could claim a life. It was a girl, an Apache girl, no more than 16 or 17 winters old. She lay sprawled in the meager shade of a juniper tree, her dark hair a tangled halo around a face pale with pain and dust. A deerskin dress, finely beaded, was torn and stained a terrifying, dark crimson along her side. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper, each intake of air a battle she was losing. He saw the wound then, a puckered, angry hole high on her ribs. A bullet wound. His first instinct, a cold and selfish thing born of grief and fear, was to turn away, to ride on. Bringing her back to the ranch was bringing the world in, the same world that had taken everything from him. It meant soldiers, questions, and the kind of violence he had spent half a decade trying to outrun. He had failed to protect his own family. What right did he have to think he could protect a stranger? But as he stood there, watching the fragile pulse beat in her slender throat, another memory surfaced, sharper and more painful than the rest. The image of his wife, Sarah, her eyes pleading with him to leave, to take their son and run, while he had stood frozen, convinced he could reason with the men who had come not for reason, but for blood. He had failed them by hesitating. He would not make that mistake again. The desert held its breath as he knelt beside the girl. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep and filled with a terror so profound it struck him to the core. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips. He holstered his rifle, the decision made. He would not leave her to the wind and the sun. He slid his arms beneath her, surprised at how little she weighed, a bird with a broken wing. As he lifted her, her body stiff with pain and fear, the world seemed to narrow to this single, desperate act. The weight of her was nothing compared to the weight of his past, but for the first time in years, carrying this burden felt less like a punishment and more like a purpose. The long ride back was a silent prayer against time, the sun beating on his back, the girl a feverish, barely conscious presence against his chest. The landscape around them remained harsh, unforgiving, but now, within its brutal emptiness, he carried a fragile spark of life. He had invited the world back in, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it would come looking for her. The ranch house was less a home than a fortress against memory. The thick adobe walls kept out the worst of the summer heat and the winter cold, but their true function was to insulate Caleb from the echoes of the past. The rooms were sparse, stripped of anything that spoke of Sarah's touch. The woven blankets, the clay pots painted with small, cheerful flowers, the child's wooden horse left by the hearth. Now, there was only utility, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bed, a stone fireplace. Into this stark sanctuary, he carried the Apache girl. He laid her gently on his own bed, the only soft surface in the house, and for a moment, the sight of her lying there, so vulnerable against the coarse wool blanket, felt like a desecration of his carefully constructed emptiness. He pushed the feeling aside. There was work to do. He stoked the fire in the main room stove, putting a kettle of water on to boil. His movements were methodical, honed by years of solitude. He gathered clean rags from a wooden chest, a bottle of whiskey not meant for drinking, and the small leather pouch that held his suturing needle and gut thread. Tending to livestock had taught him a rough sort of medicine, but this was different. This was a human life, balanced on the edge of a knife. When he returned to the bedside, she was watching him. Her eyes, wide and dark, followed his every move, her fear a palpable thing in the quiet room. He met her gaze, holding it for a long moment. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. The words felt strange in his mouth, too soft for the hard lines of his life. She gave no sign she understood. He gestured to her wound, then to the basin of hot water and the rags. A silent question, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps just resignation, passed through her eyes. She did not fight him as he carefully cut away the blood-stiffened deerskin around the bullet hole. The wound was ugly, inflamed at the edges but thankfully clean, the bullet having passed through. The whiskey he used to sterilize the area earned a sharp hiss of breath, her hands clenching in a fist at her sides, but she made no other sound. Her control was formidable. He worked with a concentration that blocked out everything else, the howling wind, the ghosts in the corners of the room, the looming threat of who had done this to her. His hands, calloused and scarred from ranch work, moved with an unpracticed gentleness as he cleaned the entry and exit wounds. He stitched the torn flesh with steady, even movements, his focus narrowed to the needle, the thread, the slow closing of the gap. She watched his face the entire time, her gaze unwavering, as if trying to read the truth of him in the lines around his eyes. When he was finished, he bandaged her side with clean linen, his touch light and respectful. He pulled the blanket up to her chin and saw the exhaustion that had replaced the terror in her eyes. He left a cup of water on the small table by the bed before retreating to the main room, leaving the door ajar. He had not slept that night. He sat in the chair by the cold hearth, his rifle across his knees, and listened. He listened to the sound of her breathing, shallow at first, then deepening as sleep finally took her. He listened to the house settling around him, the groan of the old wood, the whisper of the draft under the door. And he listened to the immense, pressing silence of the land outside, a silence that felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. A predator holds its breath before the strike. The world he had tried so desperately to shut out was now sleeping in his bed, and he was its reluctant guardian. The vulnerability he saw in her mirrored the raw, unhealed wound inside himself. By saving her, he had chained himself to her fate, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that the men who had put a bullet in her would not be content to let her simply disappear into the desert. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a man with a target on his back. The dawn broke gray and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of ash and bone. He looked at his hands, still stained with her blood, and felt the first stirrings of a feeling he had thought long dead. Resolve. The days bled into one another, measured not by the sun's passage, but by the girl's slow return to the world of the living. She slept for most of the first 2 days, a deep, healing sleep broken by feverish spells where she would murmur in her own tongue, her hands grasping at the blanket as if warding off unseen phantoms. During these times, Caleb would sit by her bed, bathing her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. He didn't offer words of comfort. He had none to give. Instead, he offered his presence, a silent, steady anchor in the storm of her nightmares. He moved about his chores with a new, quiet purpose. He mended the corral fence, checked the well, and tended to his small herd, but his awareness was always tethered to the house, to the fragile life within it. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He found her awake, propped up against the pillows, her eyes clear and watchful. She accepted the broth he offered, sipping it slowly from the wooden bowl, her gaze never leaving his face. The silence between them was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and a deep, instinctual caution. She was like a wild thing, a hawk he'd found with a broken wing, and he knew any sudden move, any misspoken word, could shatter the fragile truce they had established. Her healing began in small increments. First, she was able to sit up on her own. Then, she stood, her hand braced against the wall, her legs unsteady but determined. She began to move around the small cabin, a silent shadow observing the sparse details of his life. She touched the worn handle of a cast iron skillet, ran a slender finger over the nicks in the wooden table, and stared for a long time at the empty space on the mantelpiece where a photograph once stood. She saw the ghost of a life lived here, and in her quiet observation, Caleb felt seen in a way he hadn't been in years. She began to help. One afternoon, he came in from the stables to find she had mended a tear in his work shirt with thread she'd unraveled from spare rag. The stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of delicate artistry against the coarse, faded fabric. Another time, she took the wooden spoon from his hand as he stirred a pot of stew and added a pinch of dried herbs she had found hanging from a rafter, herbs Sarah had hung there an eternity ago. She didn't speak, but her actions were a language all their own, a quiet offering of gratitude, and a claim to her place in this temporary world. The first word came a week after her arrival. He was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, the metallic click of the parts a familiar, rhythmic sound in the evening quiet. She sat across from him, sharpening a small skinning knife with a whetstone. "Ayana," she said, her voice soft but clear. He looked up, startled. She pointed a finger at her own chest. "Ayana," he nodded slowly, committing the name to memory. It sounded like a prayer. "Caleb," he replied, gesturing to himself. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips before vanishing. It was a start. The name was a bridge across the chasm of silence. After that, the nightmares seemed to lessen. He would still hear her cry out sometimes, a sharp, choked sound of terror, and he would go to her doorway and stand watch until her breathing evened out again. He never asked what demons chased her through the darkness. He knew they were kin to his own. He also knew that her demons had names and faces, and that they were still out there, under the same cold, star-dusted sky. The threat was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their shared solitude, a storm gathering just over the horizon. He found himself watching the long, empty road that led to the ranch more and more, his hand never far from the rifle propped against the wall. The fragile piece of their routine was a stolen thing, and they both knew it. He was no longer just hiding, he was protecting. And in that simple, terrifying truth, the walls he had built around his heart began to show the first small, hairline cracks. The night the story came, a storm was brooding over the mesas, the air thick and heavy with the scent of rain and ozone. Lightning spiderwebbed across the distant sky, illuminating the jagged peaks in silent, ghostly flashes. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth, a small bastion of warmth and light against the growing darkness. Ayana had been quiet all evening, her movements stiff, her gaze fixed on the flames, as if seeing things in their dance that he could not. She had healed remarkably. The wound on her side was now a puckered scar, a physical reminder of a trauma that still lived, raw and unhealed, behind her eyes. Caleb sat at the table, mending a piece of tack, the familiar work of his hands a comfort. He could feel her unease like a change in barometric pressure. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, pulling him from his work. They will not stop looking. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a chilling finality. Caleb set down the leather strap and needle. He met her gaze across the flickering space between them. "The soldiers," he said, his own voice quiet. She nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Their leader, a man named Holt, Commander Kane Holt." She spoke the name as if it were a curse, her fingers tightening around the mug of cooled tea in her hands. "He has a face like a hawk, but the eyes of a snake for a long time." She said nothing more, and Caleb did not press her. He had learned the rhythm of her communication, the value of patience. He waited, letting the silence stretch, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, freighted with a horror that made the hair on his arms stand up. "My people, we were meet with the agent from the fort. A treaty for passage through the canyon, for hunting rights. It was a promise of peace." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was with my father, the chief. We went ahead of the others to prepare the meeting ground. I was gathering herbs, hidden in the brush. I heard them first, her eyes unfocused, looking back into the memory. Holt and his men. They did not know I was there. He was talking to his sergeant. He called the treaty a lie, a convenience." The words came faster now, tumbling out as if the dam of her silence had finally broken. "He said the agent was a fool, that the only way to secure the territory was to remove the threat. Permanently. He spoke of a preemptive strike. He called it cleansing the borderlands. He was not planning a meeting. He was planning a massacre." The air in the small cabin grew cold, the fire's warmth unable to touch the chill that emanated from her words. A massacre. The word hung between them, obscene and brutal. Caleb felt a familiar, sickening dread coil in his stomach. It was the same blind, hateful arrogance that had led men to his own door years ago. Men who saw his wife's people not as human beings, but as obstacles to be removed. "They found my father's horse," Ayanna continued, her voice trembling but steady. "Holt knew someone had been there. They began to search. I tried to run, to get back to the encampment, to warn them. They saw me." She unconsciously touched the scar on her side. "They shot at me like I was an animal, to silence me, so no one would know their plan until it was too late." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading, desperate. "They are not just hunting me, Caleb. They are hunting the truth. If they find me, they will kill me. And then they will ride to the Shining Creek encampment, and they will kill everyone." The full weight of her revelation settled over him, suffocating and immense. This was no longer about sheltering a wounded fugitive. He was now the sole guardian of a truth that held hundreds of lives in the balance. The isolation he had cultivated for 5 years had been a fantasy. The world had not only found him, it had made him its unwilling fulcrum. He looked at Ayanna, seeing not just a frightened girl, but the embodiment of all the innocence he had failed to protect before. Her story had unearthed his own buried trauma, laying it bare in the firelight. The face of Kane Holt, a man he had never met, merged with the faces of the men who had destroyed his life. It was the same monster, wearing a different uniform. The storm broke then, the first heavy drops of rain spattering against the roof, the wind howling around the eaves like a keening mourner. But inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had passed, leaving behind a terrible, clarifying calm. The rain fell for 2 days, a relentless gray curtain that turned the world to mud and blurred the lines of the horizon. It was a reprieve, a gift of time he knew they could not afford to waste. Ayanna's story had changed everything. The quiet fear that had lived on the fringes of their existence had now moved to the center, a cold, hard certainty that demanded action. The question was no longer if Holt would come, but when. And Caleb knew, with a resolve that solidified in his gut like cooling iron, that he would be ready. The man who had hidden from the world for 5 years was gone, scoured away by the girl's testimony. In his place stood someone else, a man he barely recognized but understood intimately. It was the man he should have been the day Sarah died. He began his preparations in the steady, pouring rain, the cold water soaking through his coat, but he barely felt it. His focus was absolute. He started with the corral, reinforcing the posts, checking every inch of the fence. It wouldn't stop a determined man, but it would slow them down, create an obstacle. He moved to the small barn, his movements economical and precise. He dragged heavy sacks of grain and old farming equipment, barricading the wide main door, leaving only the small, defensible side entrance. He boarded up the single window that faced the road, plunging the interior into a dusty gloom. His mind was a map of angles and firing lines. He saw the battlefield his home was about to become. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken purpose. Ayanna watched him, her dark eyes missing nothing. She saw the shift in him, the transformation from gentle caregiver to hardened strategist. There was no fear in her gaze, only a shared determination. She was no longer his patient. She was his partner. While he worked outside, she took inventory inside. She laid out their meager supplies on the table. A half sack of flour, dried beans, smoked meat, a few tins of peaches he'd bought months ago in a rare trip to town. She checked the water barrels, ensuring they were full to the brim with fresh rainwater. She tore linen sheets into neat strips for bandages. Her efficiency was a quiet echo of his own. She was a warrior in her own right, preparing for a different kind of battle. One evening, as he was cleaning his weapons by the fire, the Winchester rifle, his Colt revolver, and an old, heavy shotgun, she came to him. She carried a small, leather pouch. Without a word, she opened it and emptied its contents onto the blanket beside him. It was a bow, unstrung, and a handful of arrows. The bow was sinew-backed juniper, a beautiful, deadly thing. The arrowheads were expertly knapped flint, sharp enough to shave with. "My father's," she said softly. "He gave it to me." To learn, he picked up the bow, feeling its weight, its perfect balance. It was a weapon of silence and surprise. "Do you know how to use it?" he asked. She nodded. "I know the way of it." She then pointed to the landscape outside the window, a gesture that encompassed the rocky outcrops, the deep arroyos, the sparse cover of the junipers. "This is not their land," she said, her voice laced with a quiet confidence. "They are loud here. They do not see the shadows. I do." In that moment, he understood she was offering him more than just another weapon. She was offering her knowledge, her heritage, her own unique strength. They were a strange alliance. The broken rancher with his guns and his grief, and the Apache girl with her bow and her people's wisdom. The last of the rain passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a brilliant, aching blue. The calm was unnerving. Every sound was magnified. The drip of water from the eaves, the cry of a distant hawk, the frantic beat of his own heart. He stood at the window, looking out at the long dirt track that was his only connection to the world, the road that would bring Kane Holt to his door. He felt Ayanna come to stand beside him. They didn't speak. They just watched the empty horizon together, two solitary figures braced against the coming storm. The decision had been made. The preparations were complete. There was nothing left to do but wait for the world to arrive. The sun rose higher, burning the last of the moisture from the air, returning the land to its familiar state of thirst. The quiet was profound, a hell breath. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on the eye. Caleb had positioned himself at the main room window, the one he'd left unboarded. It offered the clearest view of the approach, a long, exposed stretch of road cutting through the greasewood flats. His Winchester rested on the sill, its wooden stock smooth and cool against his cheek. Ayanna was in the back room, the small window there giving her a view of the arroyo and the broken land behind the house. She had her father's bow, strung and ready, 3 arrows stuck in the dirt floor beside her. They had become a unit, their separate positions part of a single, desperate defense. He had given her his final instruction in a low, even voice. "If they get past me, you run. Don't look back. Take the horse and ride for the high country. Get to your people." She had only nodded, her expression unreadable, but he knew she would not run. Her fight was here as much as his. The dust came first, a faint, distant plume rising against the cerulean sky, almost indistinguishable from a dust devil. But this cloud did not dance. It moved with a steady, relentless purpose. Caleb's heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He watched as the plume grew, resolving itself into distinct shapes. Riders, 6 of them. They moved with the easy arrogance of men who believe they hold all the power, their blue uniforms stark against the ochre landscape. At their head rode a man on a tall black horse, his posture ramrod straight, a glint of brass on his collar. Even from this distance, Caleb could feel the man's aura of command. Kane Holt. He felt a cold rage settle over him, displacing the fear. This was the man who spoke of cleansing the land, who would murder women and children for the sake of convenience. This was the face of the monster that had haunted his life. The soldiers reined in about 100 yards from the house, their horses stamping and blowing in the sudden stillness. Holt dismounted, his movements crisp and authoritative. He strode forward, stopping just out of easy pistol range, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. "In the house," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. "My name is Commander Holt, United States Cavalry. I'm looking for a fugitive, an Apache girl. Send her out now, and you will not be harmed." Caleb remained silent, motionless behind the glass. He would not give Holt the satisfaction of a reply. He would not engage in a parley with a man who dealt in lies. Holt waited a moment, his handsome face tightening with impatience. "I know she's in there, rancher. We tracked her to this valley. Don't be a fool. This is government business. You are harboring a savage, an enemy of the peace. Protecting her makes you an enemy as well." The hypocrisy of the words was breathtaking. Enemy of the peace. He glanced back toward the hallway. He could not see Ayanna, but he could feel her presence, her silent, defiant energy. He was not just protecting her. He was standing with her. Holt's patience snapped. He turned to his men. "Sergeant, a warning shot. Let's get his attention." The sharp crack of a carbine shattered the silence. The bullet punched through the window pane just inches from Caleb's head, spraying him with tiny shards of glass. The sound echoed off the buttes, a declaration of war. Caleb didn't flinch. He slowly, deliberately, raised his Winchester, sighted down the long barrel, and placed the bead of the front sight squarely on the chest of the man who had fired. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar was a deafening answer to Holt's command. The soldier jerked backward, a look of pure astonishment on his face, before crumpling to the ground. A shocked silence fell over the small group of men. Holt stared at his fallen soldier, then at the house, his expression shifting from arrogant certainty to venomous fury. "You son of a bitch!" he screamed, his voice raw with rage. "Light them up! Burn them out!" The world erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the adobe walls, thudding like angry fists. Wood splintered from the window frames. The siege had begun. The small house became a universe of noise and violence. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the dust shaken loose from the old adobe walls. Bullets hammered against the exterior, some punching through the wooden shutters with vicious, splintering cracks. Caleb worked from his position at the front window, a grimly efficient machine of defense. He fired, worked the lever action of the Winchester, fired again. Each shot was deliberate, aimed not to kill indiscriminately, but to suppress, to make them fear the space between their cover and his walls. He was no soldier, but he knew the rhythms of a fight. He knew that panic was a more effective weapon than any bullet. He dropped one man who broke cover, trying for a better angle near the water trough. The man went down with a cry, clutching his leg, and scrambled back behind a rocky outcrop. 2 down, 4 to go. He heard a twang from the back of the house, sharp and distinct from the roar of the carbines, followed by a choked cry. "Ayanna." He risked a glance down the dark hallway and saw her, a fierce silhouette against the small window, already knocking another arrow. She had found her mark. Through the shattered front window, he saw Holt dragging the man she'd shot, an arrow protruding from his shoulder, behind the relative safety of the stone wellhead. The commander's face was contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had expected a cowering rancher, easily intimidated. He had found a fortress defended by ghosts. "Flank him," Holt bellowed, his voice tight with rage. "Get around the back. You can't watch both sides." 2 soldiers broke from cover, sprinting in opposite directions, one toward the barn, the other toward the rocky slope that led around the rear of the house. Caleb's heart hammered. Holt was right. He couldn't be in 2 places at once. He fired at the one heading for the barn, kicking up dirt at the man's heels and forcing him to dive behind the corral fence. But the other man was gone, lost in the blind spot. A frantic few seconds passed. Caleb held his breath, his ears straining for any sound over the sporadic fire from Holt and the others. Then he heard it again, the sharp, clean thwang of the bowstring. A scream cut short. Silence from the back of the house. Ayanna was holding her own. A fierce, protective pride swelled in Caleb's chest. They had underestimated her, seen her as a prize to be reclaimed, a victim. They had not seen the warrior. A bullet slammed into the window frame next to his head, showering his face with splinters. One pierced his cheek, a sharp, sudden sting. He ignored it, wiping the blood away with the back of his hand as he sighted on the puff of smoke from behind the rocks. He fired, and was rewarded with a yelp of pain. The fight settled into a grim stalemate. Holt and his two remaining conscious men were pinned down, unable to advance without exposing themselves to Caleb's rifle or Ayanna's silent, deadly arrows. But Caleb knew time was not on his side. He was bleeding, his ammunition was finite, and his small home offered limited protection against determined men with time to plan. The sun beat down, turning the interior of the house into an oven. Sweat stung the cut on his cheek and plastered his shirt to his back. He could feel exhaustion beginning to creep in at the edges of his focus. He risked a call down the hall. "Ayanna, are you all right?" Her voice came back, steady and calm, a balm to his frayed nerves. "I am here." The Shadow Walker is pinned behind the woodpile Shadow Walker. A perfect name for the soldier trying to sneak around the back. They were trapped in a deadly dance. For every move Holt made, they had an answer. But Caleb knew it couldn't last. Holt was a commander. He would be patient. He would wait for nightfall. He would wait for them to run out of water, or bullets, or hope. The thought had barely formed in his mind when he saw Holt wave one of his men back. The soldiers scrambled away, disappearing over a low rise. A runner, going for reinforcements. The knot of dread in Caleb's stomach tightened. They weren't just in a siege anymore. They were on a clock. The afternoon sun began its slow, merciless descent, stretching the shadows of the buttes like long, skeletal fingers across the valley floor. The gunfire had dwindled to sporadic, potshot exchanges, a war of attrition. Holt was content to wait them out, to let the certainty of his coming reinforcements crush their will. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. Caleb had moved back from the window, conserving his dwindling supply of cartridges. He had maybe 20 rounds left for the Winchester and a full cylinder in his Colt. It was not enough. He reloaded the revolver, the metallic clicks of his cylinder turning, sounding unnervingly loud in the relative quiet. He felt a presence and looked up. Ayanna stood in the doorway of the hall, her father's bow held loosely in her hand. Her face was smudged with dirt, and there was a new, hard light in her eyes. She was no longer the wounded girl he had found by the juniper tree. She was a survivor, forged in the crucible of this fight. "He sent a man for more soldiers," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. She nodded, her gaze steady. "I saw." She walked over to the water barrel and dipped a cup, bringing it to him. Her hand was steady as she offered it. He drank, the cool water a small miracle against his parched throat. Their eyes met over the rim of the cup, a moment of silent acknowledgement. They had fought together, bled together. A bond had been forged between them, stronger than steel, tempered in gunfire. "When night comes, he will try to burn us out," she said, her voice low. It was the logical next step, a brutal but effective tactic. He had known it, too, but hearing her say it aloud gave it a terrifying weight. He looked around the small room, the only home he had known for 5 years. He saw the ghosts of Sarah and his son, not as painful specters anymore, but as a quiet, encouraging presence. He was finally doing what he should have done for them. He was making a stand. But courage was not a shield against fire. As if summoned by their thoughts, a sound drifted on the evening breeze, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was not the sound of shod horses or marching soldiers. It was something else entirely, a rhythmic chanting, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Caleb and Ayanna exchanged a look of confusion, then alarm. Caleb moved cautiously back to the window, peering out into the twilight. Holt and his remaining men had heard it too. They were standing, their weapons half raised, looking toward the high ridges to the east. And then Caleb saw them. On the crest of the mesa, silhouetted against the deepening purple of the sky, were figures on horseback. Dozens of them. They were not wearing blue uniforms. They were bare-chested, their faces painted for war, their hair long and unbound. Apache warriors. A war cry, sharp and piercing, echoed across the valley, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. It was answered by another and another, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their power. Holt and his men, whose seconds before had been the confident predators, were now frozen in place, their faces pale with a primal fear. They were caught in the open, surrounded, their position of power utterly reversed. The warriors began their descent from the mesa, not in a clumsy charge, but flowing down the rocky inclines like water, their ponies sure-footed and swift. They fanned out, encircling the small pocket of soldiers with breathtaking speed and efficiency. They were ghosts in the landscape, masters of the terrain Holt had sought to claim. The fight was over before it truly began. It was not a battle. It was a reckoning. The soldiers threw down their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. The warriors dismounted, surrounding them, their faces grim, their silence more menacing than any threat. The tide had not just turned. It had become a tidal wave, and it was about to crash down on Kane Holt. From the cabin window, Caleb watched, his rifle lowered, a profound sense of awe washing over him. This was not his victory. He had simply held the line long enough for justice to arrive. The aftermath of the warriors' arrival was swift and silent. There was no chaotic violence, no cry for vengeance. There was only a cold, methodical process of disarmament. The soldiers, including the man Ayanna had wounded and the one Caleb had shot in the leg, were herded into a tight, terrified group. Their weapons were collected and piled unceremoniously on the ground. The Apache warriors moved with a purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying to behold, a living embodiment of the land itself, which had risen up to defend its own. A tall, broad-shouldered man with streaks of white in his hair, clearly the war leader, approached the cabin. He stopped a respectful distance from the door, his gaze fixed on the entrance. Caleb opened the door and stepped out into the twilight, his rifle held loosely at his side. He nodded once to the warrior, a gesture of acknowledgement. The warrior's eyes, dark and piercing, scanned Caleb from head to toe, taking in the blood-streaked face, the exhaustion, the resolve. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then Ayanna appeared in the doorway behind Caleb. The moment the war leader saw her, his stern expression softened. He spoke her name, his voice a low rumble of relief and reverence. The other warriors turned, their hard faces breaking into expressions of wonder. They had not come for a battle. They had come for her. They had been tracking her, following the trail of soldiers who hunted her, and had arrived at the moment of ultimate crisis. Ayanna walked past Caleb, her posture straight and proud. She was no longer a refugee. She was the daughter of a chief, a survivor, the keeper of a sacred truth. She walked directly to the captured Kane Holt. The commander stood stripped of his authority, his uniform dusty and torn, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. He glared at her, a cornered snake ready to strike, but there was nowhere to go. Ayanna began to speak, her voice clear and carrying in the stillness. She spoke first in her own language, her words flowing like a river, recounting Holt's lies, his treachery, the massacre he had planned at Shining Creek. The faces of the warriors around her grew harder, their eyes burning with a cold fire as they listened. Then she switched to English for Holt's benefit, for Caleb's, for the world's. "You came into our lands under a banner of peace," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that belied her years. "You offered words of treaty while planning a river of blood. You silenced my father. You try to silence me. You believe this land is yours to take, to cleanse, but this land does not belong to men like you. It does not yield to hate." Holt sneered, a last vestige of his arrogance. "You're savages. You understand nothing but violence." The war leader stepped forward, his presence immense. He looked down at Holt not with anger, but with a profound, pitying contempt. "It is you who understands nothing," the warrior said, his English measured and deep. "You see life as a thing to be conquered. We see it as a thing to be lived. You believe power comes from a uniform and a gun. We know it comes from the people, from the truth." He turned to his men and gave a command in their native tongue. Two warriors stepped forward and roughly stripped hold of his coat, the brass buttons popping and scattering in the dust. They took his sidearm, his belt, his boots. They left him standing in his shirt and trousers, a diminished, pathetic figure under the vast, star-filled sky. "Death would be a mercy you have not earned," the war leader declared. "Your sentence is the land you despise. You will be left here, with nothing. If you are strong, you may find your way back to your world. If you are weak, the sun and the stones will be your jury. You are banished." They turned their backs on him then, a dismissal more profound than any execution. Kane Holt, the commander, the conqueror, was left alone, a ghost in the making, to be judged by the harsh, impartial justice of the desert. Caleb watched, a silent witness to a judgment that was as elemental and final as the landscape itself. His role was over. He had been the guardian of the sanctuary, the man who held the door. The final reckoning belonged to Ayanna and her people. The warriors departed as quietly as they had arrived. They gathered their wounded, and Holt's, and melted back into the mesas, leaving behind only the trampled earth and the profound silence of the desert night. They left Kane Holt where he stood, a solitary figure shrinking into the vast darkness. They also left one horse, a sturdy pinto, tied to the corral fence, a gift. Acknowledgement. Payment. Caleb and Ayanna stood by the door of the damaged cabin, watching until the last of them had disappeared. The air, so recently filled with violence and the promise of more, was now still. The only sound was the sigh of the wind through the shattered window pane. They turned and looked at each other in the moonlight. They were both covered in dust and grime, stained with blood, his from the splinter, hers from an arrow's fletching that had scraped her arm. They were exhausted to the bone, but they were alive, and they were victorious. Inside, the cabin was a wreck. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. But it was standing. The walls had held. Silently, they began to set their small world right. Caleb swept up the broken glass, while Ayanna righted the table and chairs. He fetched water, and she gently cleaned the cut on his cheek, her touch feather-light. He, in turn, examined the long scrape on her arm, applying a salve that would prevent infection. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken understanding, their shared ordeal having stripped away all need for pretense. The space between them was no longer filled with caution or silence, but with a deep and quiet connection. Later, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing light on their weary faces. The ghosts that had haunted Caleb's house for 5 long years were quiet. They had not vanished, but their mournful power had faded, replaced by the reality of his actions. He had not been able to save Sarah and his son, but he had saved Ayanna. He had stood against the same darkness that had consumed his family and had not flinched. It was not a perfect absolution, but it was a form of redemption he could live with. He had found a purpose in the defense of another, and in doing so, had begun to heal himself. "Will you go with them?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was low, careful. He looked at the fire, not at her, afraid of what her answer might be. She was quiet for a long moment. "My place is with my people," she said softly. "But they're safe now. The truth is known. The agent from a fort will hear of this. Holt's plans are broken." She turned her head, and he felt her eyes on him. "This place, you have made it a sanctuary. The land knows what you did here." He finally met her gaze. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a profound respect and a shared strength. He had thought his life was over, a long, empty epilogue to a story of tragedy. But now, looking at her, he felt the stirrings of a new chapter. The future was no longer a threat to be avoided, but an unknown country to be explored. "You could stay," he said, the word coming out before he had fully formed the thought. "For a while. The walls need mending. The land needs tending, It was a clumsy offer, but it was honest. It was an invitation not just to share a space, but to share a future, however uncertain. She smiled, a true, brilliant smile that lit up her face and reached her eyes. "The walls did not break," she said, "and the land is strong. Like you, in the morning, they stood together outside the cabin, looking east as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The air was clean and new. The harsh landscape no longer seemed like a prison of his grief, but a canvas of immense and rugged beauty, a testament to resilience. He had faced his past, not by outrunning it, but by standing his ground. He had found a reason to fight, a reason to live, in the fierce, dark eyes of a girl he had rescued from the dust. And she, in turn, had found not just a savior, but an ally. They were two survivors, scarred but unbroken, looking toward a new dawn, together. The wind still blew across the mesas, but to Caleb, it no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like a promise.